The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Breaking Down Security. I am Brian Brake. If you're taking it upon yourself this year, as a New Year's resolution to educate yourself and to find a way to educate and to get your CPEs, and you thought, hey, let me just go on to iTunes and find a podcast that talks about security. You may have picked the wrong one. No, I'm just kidding.
Ouch.
That the dulcet tones you heard was Miss Berlin, Amanda Berlin. Welcome, Miss Berlin. Thank you for joining me this week on Breaking Down Security with us.
We made it to a new year.
We did, didn't we? Yeah.
2022.
Yep. Mr. Betcher won't be with us tonight. Sadly, I have a feeling he is still dealing with log4j, which is some of what our topic is tonight. But we're going to be speaking more in aggregate. So for those of you who are new to the show, we like to usually have discussions with people in the industry, people far smarter than myself, which it's a low bar, to be fair. But a lot of smart people in the industry, and a couple of people that we've got on tonight are specifically, I'm honored actually to call them friends. They've spoke at InfoSec Campout, which is one of the conferences that I attend and am organizer of and co-organizer of. And Adam spoke 2 years ago. Adam, was that right? Okay. Yeah, during the first one. Right. And then Amélie spoke at the second one. So Amélie, thank you for coming. And Adam, thank you for coming. And I will start with Amélie, and please tell us a little bit about yourself, a little background. That way we can get started with our topic this week.
Well, try to abbreviate it to that slide that was at the last InfoSec Campout. Is I do things and say stuff, but currently in the employ of a large gaming company, which I'm probably not at the liberty to disclose, other than if anybody wants to background me on that. But probably 25 years plus technology experience, mainly in security, gone from the low level engineer all the way up to exec. So, as much as I spout out about certain things, I come from a certain perspective. So thanks for the invite on this. Oddly, my first toe dip into this was about open source stuff. So, kind of blame that for the career path.
Cool. Okay. And Adam spoke at our first InfoSec Campout. At the time, he worked for a company that we will talk about a little bit in this, but he does not represent that organization. But Adam, tell people about yourself.
Yeah, hey, I'm Adam Baldwin. Let's see, I did spend some time at that organization at NPM as the VP of security. So I spent some time there. I'm currently a red team lead at a identity company. That's where I spend my time on the offensive side. Prior to joining NPM in that stint there, I ran the node security project for 8 years or something like that. All that effort turned into NPM audit and all those wonderful warnings that you see there, and in an effort to make NPM install better, more safe, whatever. Yeah, that's me.
Cool. Okay. So as we're going to go through this, and so if you've been living under a rock for the last month or so, there was a vulnerability that came out, and it's nothing new. I mean, it's one of these linchpin type systems that holds up the internet. We saw it with OpenSSL back in Heartbleed. There's a lot of NPM packages, for instance, that are very popular that people tend to break, or things happen and they get mixed up and end up crashing a ton of things because there's a lot of dependencies. The latest one was log4j, of course. Come to find out, it's pretty much in everything. And
I'm pretty sure if you were under a rock, you still would have been impacted by it.
The rock probably ran log4j. Yeah, I'm thinking so.
Probably
Java rock.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Yes. So there was some things that came out during this log4j vulnerability and then the subsequent releases that came out in the patches, where we found out that log4j, this thing that holds up the internet, much as the XKCD comic, you have this one little shim that everything appears to run on. And we find out that, the log4j devs, there's like 2 or 3 of them. They're unpaid. This is their side gig. And, there's calls for, big companies aren't paying their share, they're using open source software and they're getting away with it and what have you. And, it's the same stuff that was said before when, you have OpenSSL, there was only a handful of, I think at the time Heartbleed occurred, there was only 2 or 3 OpenSSL developers. I mean, they weren't even like a full-time thing. And, changes occurred. People found out, hey, OpenSSL is kind of a big deal on the internet. It's one of those infrastructure things that people need to fix. And we find that, log4j is another one of those. And we're, the reason I'm having Adam and Emily on is to kind of talk about that in aggregate. We're not going to be solving open source problems here, but there's definitely some things that I think we should talk about in terms of, how we can potentially stop this in the future. So let me see. There was actually, oh yeah, Miss Berlin, actually, there was a blog post that Blue Mirror put out about log4j. We can talk about that later, but
I just wanted to add it just in the show notes. We don't really have to talk about it. But.
Right. Yeah. So according to the register, they said the annoyance with a handful of project maintainers for failing to catch the bug prompted one Vulcan Yaziki to voice indignation about people bashing the maintainers with their unpaid volunteer labor without offering any financial support or distributed code fixes. Let's start with Amélie. Amélie, what was your take on log4j when you found out it was just a handful of folks doing all of this?
Well, literally, it didn't surprise me. I like I mentioned about being around for forever. I came up through the FreeBSD project and whatnot. But we mentioned Heartbleed before. I was actually at the White House in the Office of Management and Budget and supporting the CIO. And when Heartbleed came by, the initial knee-jerk reaction for that was, oh my God, let's go and do a data call to all the agencies and find out what web servers are out there, because they thought SSL, it's a web server. And I kind of turned it on its head. It's like, well, if you've ever kind of like done development and understand like how people kind of consume open source, it's not just web servers, it's database servers who've done imports of the library. It's embedded in hardware like your phones, your Android and iPhones, it's in networking equipment. And when that scope kind of expanded and they kind of finally realized like what they're dealing with, that's where, I enjoyed the hyperbole and not knocking Jen Easterly here of the worst bug that she's encountered. At the time, that was the one that was burning the world down. And one of those cases there is like, it was, I think if I remember correctly, it was like 2 guys up in Gaithersburg that were essentially the lead committers and developers for OpenSSL. I think there was a total of 4 core committers on that. And one of the biggest issues is like, the folks from DHS at the time and everyone was like, well, how do we support this? Like, if we want to kind of move better away from that, what's the structure? And I'm kind of like, well, it's not like you can just throw money at this particular problem. Just like throwing resources in the way of cash is not going to address that. Like you can't hire somebody away right away. People are motivated because they understand like open source is not only fun for some folks, but understand like that the idea of, itself, OpenSSL was a fork of another SSL library. That they wanted to make it better because the prior committers and developers for that prior fork or that prior core just abandoned it. So this is just one of those things is like people realize that it's a core functionality of software and they just want to kind of contribute back. So the fact that it's a shoestring 4-person deal was absolutely not surprising. So when log4j came around and I actually ended up tracking down who had the most amount of commits on that tree, and I'm just like, oh yeah, it's like 2 or 3 people, not surprising. That's just kind of how it is. And that's for a large project. You get a smaller project, you'd be lucky to find 1 or 2.
Right. So Adam, as the VP of security for, NPM, and you came on oh, I don't know. It's been a couple years since you came on the show. I think we had you on just before InfoSec Campout #1, but you had talked, we talked with you about, the security of those projects and those packages. And you said you had a 5-person team looking at like 800,000, 800,000 packages. And it was, expounding, you're never going to catch up and be able to do those things. Why do people do open source software? I mean, what is the impetus for having all of these packages? I don't want to say I don't get it, because I know that people like to work on things in their own time, but I mean, there's 800,000 of these apps, and some of them are like, making sure Dev knows how to do a
1.4
loop or
million
something
now.
like that. Right.
Yeah. Well, so the NPM ecosystem is that's the ecosystem I know the most. I did some Python stuff before then, but the NPM ecosystem, right? We've got Lori has better numbers on all this, and the number of new developers coming to JavaScript every day, right? Like some amazing amount of developers. CPAN, yes, all these amazing ecosystems. There's an amazing amount of developers coming to NPM on a daily, or coming to JavaScript on a daily basis, and they're learning, right? So there's this new gen, and they're publishing and they're learning, and they're creating a lot of those packages, right? My first NPM package, right? And then you've got these sort of well-established packages, companies and individuals that are shipping, production, quote unquote, supposedly production ready software, right? Like they're using this ecosystem to do that. And so they want the benefit of, the reality is the corporations want the benefit of this unpaid labor, right? Like that's the reality of what they want. They want the efficiency and the economy of that, right? Like that's what they want. That's what the companies want. Individuals, why they make open source software is for many plethora of reasons, right? Like I did it to learn and to have, to fill a need that I felt was there, right? And then all of a sudden that thing got popular, and it was like, that's like a lot of things come with that. Like I wasn't expecting.
Right. Yeah,
So,
because if it becomes super popular and it's your side gig, you saw a need, it was filled. Maybe it filled your certain need at the time, and other people are like, oh well, like this is super popular software now, and as it grows in popularity, you're just one person, right? You may have a friend working on it with you, and you can't support that. Right. There's entire software companies that can't support their own software well, and they pay their employees. So it's hard to have, and I wonder what the entire ecosystem would look like if we didn't have people with that passion, right? We
have Stack Overflow. Essentially, I think a lot of the open source communities end up being kind of like Stack Overflow and steroids, where it goes from, hey, I need this code snippet to solve this problem, to I'm contributing a fully birthed version of an idea that hopefully keeps people from spending hours trying to recreate the wheel. Mm-hmm. Although you do see some packages committed to various languages, JavaScript, Perl, Ruby and so forth, and Python, like do the same things, potentially have the same structures, but sometimes they implement it differently. But the idea is like, it's out there, it's a good starting point. But rather than like, I'm going to cut and paste from somebody's Stack Overflow post about solving this particular nit, and you're getting, 7 different ways of someone implementing, could be an insecure method, but it's just like, well, this is my kludge to address this problem. And I think, when you do have those maintained package environments, whether it be from an OS like Linux or BSD or any of the numerous ones out there, to where it's a language specific one, you're just kind of helping formalize that. And, as we're talking about before we kind of started the recording here, was then that gets into like, okay, well, now you've gotten to the point where there's a repository, there's commits, there's, feature approvals and requests. What's next? Is there resource management? Is there governance involved? Is there a hierarchy as to who has the rights to review these changes, and then who publishes like a final release for that kind of stuff?
Right.
The company in the consumer in the end has the ultimate responsibility. I said years ago, you're responsible for what you require, right? Like if I'm going to consume this package, I I need to do my diligence to reduce my risk on the dependence of that or on a commit and gate that appropriately. And I think companies are just riding high on this open source and just taking advantage of it.
Well, it's as you meant, we're talking about like the caveat emptor or buyer beware on that too. It's like,
Right.
Do they actually fully understand that if you're going to consume four locos in a row, that you're going to be like totally wired and SOL when it comes to being able to concentrate and behave? But the idea was, hey, they were free for four locos, and
There's consequences though.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing. It's the free as in beer. Like I will drink as much as my body will handle and not understand the consequences of those actions. And I think that's where we're kind of at right now. Is like, oh well, it's a smorgasbord of absolutely stuff I don't have to pay for. Oh my, and you have the regret or the shame walk the next morning, like, oh my God, what did I do? And your site's on fire and your CEO's chasing down your throat and the SOC is lit up because you did a commit because you just happened to like, oh well, this solves my problem without going through the rigor of understanding like what you imported in and what you've actually done.
Is that an engineering problem? Is that an engineering problem though? I mean, if you've got developers in your own organization just randomly pulling things in without doing any kind of vetting or whatever, I mean, people could put whatever they wanted in the stack without a user knowing. And it seems like for now and now, I mean, just less than 48 hours ago, we found out that a developer of a very popular NPM or a couple of very popular NPM modules just decided to nuke them and maliciously add a loop inside of each one of them that caused builds to fail because he was, quote, unhappy that big companies was using his stuff for free and didn't want that to work anymore. So there was some additional fallout. He lost access to his GitHub repos. Apparently we're not making light of this, but he was also doing some things on the side outside of code review and maintaining these repos where he's been arrested for bomb making materials in his house and caused a fire. So there's some other things going on there, not just the fact that he was a developer of these things. And we talked about before the show, the bomb making materials is everyone was saying that what he did with Faker and color.js was a resume generating event. And he probably is, reducing his, employability elsewhere, but also being arrested by the police for bomb making materials is going to do the same thing. Are there developers out there that build this stuff that don't expect remuneration? And, so I'm going to go to our guests, but it's, how can we get money into the hands of people who legitimately need that money? The person who busted Faker and color.js wanted to get paid six figures by some big company to maintain what amounted to a couple of fart apps that could have been written by anybody. So are those apps worth six-figure job? And I'll start with Adam.
One of those packages has 2 million downloads, right? Like there's companies relying on those that I don't know, they're relying on them, and I don't agree with the intent here, right? Like I
Right.
see the pissed off nature. I've had my own open source debacle where I started a project and had somebody basically take the data and run with it. It was MIT licensed though, right? Like I can't do much with that, right? Like,
right.
So, anyway, brain went sideways.
No, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, as you kind of mentioned about the remuneration, we're talking about, I did a free for all article because this is just a hot button topic for me in general. But that's been a struggle, pretty much since kind of the birth of a more formalized open source environment. Obviously, some of the first stuff beyond the software was, we're talking about the history of it was OS based. You've got your VAX stuff, BSD, Linux, so forth and so on. Obviously to support that, if you go back in the history, the GNU Linux, that was the idea, was it was a kernel plus utilities. And that's the same thing with like BSD. It's a fully formed OS. You can get in that whole debate about spaces and tabs along the same lines as OS. But the idea of at what point does it mature enough that you need to kind of understand like what is the structure to support it? Like how much are you going to throw on the shoulders of volunteers and goodwill? And how much do you actually need like, paying for server space? Back in the day, we didn't have GitHub, we didn't have SourceForge, we didn't have GitLab and whatnot. It was, whomever was contributing money to basically pay for a bunch of distributed CVS servers around the globe. How much of that would be then for some of these developers to take a sabbatical from their employer, if they could, or, if there was a particular feature or bug that needed to get addressed, how much time or how many resources were going to be spent for doing that. And that was few and in between until obviously, with Linux, especially when it got commercialized with Red Hat and Debian and whatnot, kind of taking money as for distributions and the like, where, as they got more corporatized, it was easy to kind of like say, well, we can do a support license and then float some of that money that back into developers to address, certain issues of our interest. We're not seeing that kind of spread out for some of the smaller packages and whatnot. So, this dude who, took a swipe to his NPM packages here, while they're considered like fart apps as it was, they're still critical in a sense that people have chosen to integrate them in. They're running on live code. That whole process of imports and vetting them is maybe something to be under examination. But with the log4j stuff is like, should those developers be remunerated for their time that they are either spending as part-time for their jobs? Like, some companies, Microsoft and so forth, and Google, they have people that are dedicated towards, contributing back to some of the core open source projects, but not everybody knows, smaller companies that aren't a Microsoft or a Google don't necessarily know how to contribute back. Like, it's not like they necessarily love free beer, they do, but sometimes there's a conscience behind that and they want to figure out like, how can we help sustain this? And there's usually not a lot of great levers for that to happen, unless a site strictly has like a Patreon or a tip jar or something like that. And, then it travels back as like, is this getting paid for infrastructure? Or is this eventually showing up as kind of like a, like a Spotify check, the way musicians argue about like getting pennies on the dollar, like, are they getting like a check slipped under the door for 12 cents for their month of fixing bugs on a particular package? So I think that's the big challenge right now is that risk reward on, where people feel like supporting it.
The few that are supporting, the few corporations that are
very few
doing some, and it's not balancing out. That's the thing, is that there's so much reliance on this open source, and if it doesn't trickle down, right? Even if I got a tip jar that my packages maybe use, whatever, and it just doesn't fill that void.
I don't think a lot of companies even know that they should like give, or that they can.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they don't, but we've been talking about it for many years, right? Like, you got this. If they took away that resource, if NPM went away and they had to write that software themselves, what is the value of that, or buy it? That's you talk about those little fart apps, those little modules made things efficient, right? They grabbed them, the software got shipped this quarter, right, instead of next year, right? Like that's.
Well, a lot of folks who are in, those CTO or VP of software development and stuff necessarily don't do those types of calculations. I mean, having been in a CTO role before, I was very cognizant of, kind of the checks we had to write for the stuff that we had to pay for versus like, if we're writing on literally a free language, Python, all the stuff that kind of comes with that is stuff that we don't have to pay a license for, say for Visual C, that we've got to pay for, the MSDN license and all the other stuff that's involved with that, a build environment and so forth. Like here, all that was free. Well, what are we actually honestly saving? And I definitely know when like 15 years ago when I was dealing with a company I was contracting for, and the CEO was like, well, we don't use open source software because you don't know, as well as there's many eyes looking on that, and that's the strength of being able to find the bugs. We don't know if the people who are giving those eyes or contributing are foreign nationals and people that we don't like. to now it's like, oh my gosh, this saved me so much money. So my overhead on what I can charge back to that is much greater. So I love open source. I don't care who's committing stuff to it. I don't care that they have a sketchy background or whatever. They've just saved me, millions of dollars. So it's that balance of altruism versus capitalism that is now kind of where we're in right now.
We're swinging, right? So like they've been winning for a long time. They've like,
This
now
is
they're
the
going to start
pendulum.
paying dividends. We're
Yeah.
going to start paying dividends on that all that software.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not much has changed though. The problem I have is, like, we talked in 2018, the event stream incident, which was, right, so a maintainer took over event stream and then basically, backdoored it. And
right.
Bob Trump.
Right.
But
Crypto miner.
what's changed, right? We still new headline. We would do IR and move on. The behaviors aren't changing in corporations, at least not that I'm seeing. People talking to, like, we do a headline and.
Well, you figure the reckoning would have been, but here we are in 2021 and 2022, literally dealing with the exact same scenario.
Right.
And the fact that I think, I was highlighting that the OpenSSF exists now because that was a result of the OpenSSL, and all these companies are like, oh my goodness, yes, we'll start this foundation and provide governance and funding and guidance and whatnot. And I've popped in on the Slack channel, and like, it's a lot of academic discussion, but there's very much like rubber road solving problems type kind of stuff. And I think that's the challenge right now, is you have these organizations or companies that are willing to try to say that they're doing good, but because there's literally like multiple silos of things, developers, the corporations, and even government or the public sector, that have different responsibilities of where they can kind of push things along to kind of help benefit folks. They're all interfacing at different places. So like, as much as, CISA's, the question is like, well, why can't DHS enforce private companies to go and provide patches and whatnot? And it's like, well, that's actually, they can't, because they're not legally allowed. That's more of a commerce FTC type kind of thing. And then the corporations are like, well, we'll start this foundation because this is an easy way for us to say we've put money towards this, and then let someone else figure it out. And then the developers are kind of like, well, we have a list of needs, but we don't know who to pass the hat to. And then even then, it's a matter of trying to prioritize, like, do we need, static code reviews, or do we need something to get certified for a certain environment, get a certain review for regulatory requirements. And that, that's all kind of these individual silos, and
that's dependent on the consumer though, right? The consumer puts those requirements on that library of whatever scrutiny they need.
Well, as the consumer, the developer, like the corporation developer, individual developer, smaller or thing, or the end user, like your parents, your significant other, your kids, like, I don't think there's anybody like, I'm happily using my iPhone or my desktop to do this thing, and oh my gosh, it doesn't work. I'm going to go chase down, my SQL developers and complain because I got this error on this website. Like,
right. Yeah, not that it, not
yeah, that's what I mean.
Developer,
like,
yeah. I understood.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the question. We've got, and so I feel like I may have touched a nerve a little bit on the fart apps thing. I do apologize for saying that. I just find it difficult to believe that 2 million downloads of a 17-line piece of code is so damned important. They couldn't just copy or fork that into their own system. So I do apologize for calling it fart apps. It's just, I see a lot of useless, apps out there that do apparently a ton of stuff, and it would just make more sense if they could just copy and paste that or keep it locally or what have you. So I do apologize. I understand that, and I am not an open source person. I did not come from code. I don't write code. Don't ask me to write code. You don't want me writing code. But so if you are in open source and you create the next new widget that everybody is going to use, should you be thinking ahead in terms of, hey, I want to get paid,
Yep.
Screw this. I'm going to get paid. You're going to pay me. And then at some point it's like, you're not open source, right?
I think if you want to get paid, don't do open source. That's my personal opinion, but
I think you should probably think that going into it, I imagine, right? Or at least not care if you don't.
Well, there's other couple models too. Definitely with a lot of corporate stuff. Tenable was known to have this particular issue, but even a former employer like Splunk, there's the community edition, which is a somewhat feature limited, but contains the core.
Right.
Where it's a little bit like a drug dealer in a way that like you get them hooked on this and maybe they'll spend the money on the full featured edition, but for folks who kind of want to just have basic functionality, you have that. There's a little bit of that pass back that if it's the core functionality that's being sponsored by corporate dollars from enterprise customers and whatnot, it just happens to be kind of neutered to a point where you can get so much. And then if you want the extra, you're paying for support or extra modules or extra capability or a license count above that. That works in certain situations, but I would hate to see somebody who would download, say, Apache and like, well, you can support 1,000 connections here, but if you want 1,001 connections, here's a request for a $400-$500 license. And it tiers up from there. And I could just imagine the bill, or Nginx, just imagine the bill from all those hosting providers out there that suddenly like they're passing that on to Joe Schmo who's got an account at Media Temple or wherever, and suddenly their monthly rate has gone from like $100 a month to $300 a month because they're now having to cover the overhead on those types of licenses. So that just has this whole trickle down into the consumer, as as Adam mentioned, that whole consumer environment of like, do you then kind of slow down the adaptation of companies and organizations to new technology in general, because it just becomes overly expensive because you've reached those certain thresholds and cutoffs.
Yeah.
Are we gonna get FTC involvement now, because we've not essentially as an industry policed ourselves well enough? Like,
it's a matter of how that's getting articulated by the folks who have influence on those lawmakers. I can imagine that at some point this spring, we may most likely have some type of hearing, where, much like they dragged in the folks to talk about cryptocurrency. I'm sure there's going to be another reckoning where they'll call in the heads of CISA and commerce and some other experts and whatnot to kind of come in and say, well, we're in this mess and it costs the economy this amount of potentially billions of dollars at this point of lost work and efforts put into it. But the issue is, and as Brian kind of mentioned earlier, is much like OpenSSL, where it's a kind of not flash in the pan, but you've got to have that zeitgeist where everybody's kind of like, we're focused on this, let's address it and let's carry it forward. Like Equifax, that was one of those cases where everybody was hot and bothered. It kind of petered out. Then he had another hearing. They had some legal requirements about that. And a couple of years on, you've seen the outcomes of that, but it's not been like anything where lessons have been learned, things have changed. And this is just one of those cases of, we'll have a hearing, we'll have some probably regulatory changes and oversight stuff. But if we're going to see something in the marketplace, then you're starting to think it's not just a US problem. This is a global issue. There's going to probably be some stuff in the European Union and other places in APAC and whatnot. So,
yeah. So the licensing was thank you for whoever put the licensing overview down in the show notes there. Thank you. So there was a number of things also that I saw when all this hit. Not the log4j stuff, but the Faker and the colors.js stuff. As we talked about before, there was a couple of camps. It was like, hey, he should be able to do whatever he wants with his code. It's his code. There were other folks that were like, yeah, no, that's, at some point it's no longer your code because it's affecting other people. There's, you can argue for and against on both sides of that. He can actually do what he wants with that. And some people had mentioned, hey, the as is license in all of these open source, especially the Apache license. It's like, they aren't required, the developers aren't required to give you patches. We were talking about the log4j stuff. It's under an Apache license. So the developers could have said, you know what, we're not going to patch this. You do you. This is open source. You fork it, you patch it, you do whatever you need to do. And in many cases, they, out of goodwill or societal, convention, they went ahead and spent all this extra time, patching it. I don't know where they work. I hope their work had given them the time off to be able to do that. And maybe their time, their job realized, hey, they're kind of important to the internet. Maybe we should give them a pay raise or something. I don't know. But do developers do themselves a disservice by doing things that they're not licensing to do? If it's as is, then, the log4j people could have said, I licensed it. Here it is. Do whatever you want with it. I'm not going to patch anything. And Adam, I think you had some comment about that before we started about that.
Depends on how you want, I don't know, depends on how you want your community to be run, like, or how, if you want to just be, well, you're on your own, right? Like, or do you want to be?
Did they have a community though? I mean, does every open source project have a community?
I'd say no. There's a user community, probably.
Yeah.
There's people who use it, but I doubt that they're like getting together, every year in Vegas and chatting about whatever.
The user base is a better.
Right.
I feel like at a certain size, maybe.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we get those, the KubeCon and stuff like that. That's kind of where you reach that critical mass where you can kind of say there is a community base or whatever. But I doubt that there's no, faker con or something like that to kind of knock on the NPM stuff. But
there's probably just a bunch of commit messages, just pull requests and
a lot of entitled expectations.
Exactly. And there was an example, it's been within the last year and a half or something, but there was an ad blocker that was very popular in browsers. And the dev basically said, I'm pulling chocks. I'm selling this to a nice Turkish company that's going to be able to do stuff with it. I had a backlog for my backlog. And, I'm doing all this work myself and I'm not getting any help and I'm just done. I'm going to sell it to this nice Turkish company for a couple $1 million. And everyone was like, oh my God, you can't do this. Don't do that, whatever. And then all of a sudden, like most things that get sold, they get automatically added to, specific white listings get done for specific sites that were running ads and, polluted this plugin. And people were like, oh my God, I can't believe you did this. It's so irresponsible. And then others were like, well, it's his code. He can pretty much do what he wants with it.
Well, that was a bit with Tenable. Like, I spoke to Ron Gula about the time, like for a while, it was, I wouldn't say necessarily open source, but one of the reasons that they actually closed things down and then there was a fork was, Ron told me, I was like, he was tired of seeing, consulting companies basically use the open source stuff and go make money off of it that was well and above the kind of income that Tenable was making. All right, now this is a product. So if you want to go and fork this branch of it, go have fun, it still have the same licensing to it, but now, Tenable was going to make that money and good for them because I think it probably increased quality. There was some control over that. There, was, the UX and stuff improved on it and they were able to kind of expand the product line. So, as you mentioned about that Turkish guy is like, or selling to the Turkish companies, like that's one of those things is like sometimes closing things down like that helps things get more mature and more stable because there's an architecture behind it. There's planning. There's release schedule, and once people are paying for the stuff, there's resources around to kind of go make this hopefully a better product.
Yep, no, I agree. I do. So we talked about community. We've talked about should developers expect remuneration from this? We were yes and no depending on the level of complexity. Are these when in the cycle of your package or your application or your lines of code or something, do you need to start thinking about those things and not just thinking about it, but communicating that to people? It's like, hey, I've got a thing. It's fairly popular. I'm getting more than 1,000 downloads a day, And some people also did say about Faker and Colors.js that this person did give warning before he was going to, make changes or add things. So there was time to fork it. But so if, I come up with the next greatest thing, at what point in the process should I be thinking about what the future looks like, or when does it stop becoming a hobby? Is it when it takes up my entire weekend, or I mean, what I'm just trying to figure out.
You gotta have some self-control, Brian. You don't want to be doing open source on the weekend.
You don't? Yeah. No, see, I think a lot of people get into this with ideas that, they're just making this little thing. And then all of a sudden it's big and they're like, oh crap, now I've got to spend a whole weekend because I've got 1,800, requests for X, feature. At what point do you say, I can't do this anymore? Is it
I did that with Helmet.
Thing?
So I
really?
wrote Helmet, which is you put it in Express. It's like security headers for the framework, right? It gets a
okay.
1.5 million downloads a week or whatever. I haven't cut a release in years. I just walked away. I went like this, and
Okay.
I another developer that was contributing picked it up and ran with it. They could have been malicious, right? Like
Right.
they still could. They could bring in somebody and have.
Is there a control? Is there a control thing there? I mean, what made you say, yeah, I'm done? Or did you just, you let it go and you realize 3 months later, oh, I haven't touched that code in 3 months?
Like it's
Burnout.
so
Okay.
I felt the user base needed releases, right? I felt like it had become popular enough that people relied on it, and that it required a level of an SLA of some kind that I couldn't meet. And so I was just like, well, I'm going to drop it on the floor, so somebody might as well keep running with it. But I had a job, right? I was running a company and doing all those things. I didn't need that income. If I was jobless, and this thing was getting popular, I could see I'd want to do something. Like, that's the thing I've created. Like, I'd want some compensation for it of some kind. But if I didn't set myself up to take advantage of that thing, or trying to take advantage of it, I guess, I don't know.
That was our show for this week. You can find show notes for this and all of our shows at www.breakingsecurity.com. You can also find an RSS link on the site to add to your favorite podcatcher. You can find all of us on Twitter. Miss Berlin can be found at InfoSyster, INFOSYSTIR. Mr. Betcher can be found at BetcherPwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. And you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. We have a Slack. Come join us on our Slack. A lot of great things going on there. A lot of channels of various InfoSec-related subjects. You can get an invite on Twitter by emailing our official Twitter handle for the show at Brakesec, BRAKESEC, or you can email us at bds.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for their monetary assistance by offsetting costs involved in putting out a weekly show. Zoom fees, Libsyn hosting, domain purchase, renewal, equipment upgrades, time and effort building the community we have. We appreciate all of your help and support. If you'd like a t-shirt, stickers, coffee mug, or just to show your support for the show, you can check out our TPub site, www.tpublic.com/user/BDS podcast. We thrive on your feedback. A quick 5-star comment on iTunes or Google Play Store or your favorite streaming service, Spotify, Pandora, what have you, go a long way to gaining us additional visibility. It takes no time at all, and we appreciate your help in spreading the word. That was it for Breaking Down Security this week. Be safe, be well, be kind to one another. Take care of yourself because you're the only you have. And we'll talk to you again soon.